Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening to some of you. Welcome to this session on youth engagement, why it matters and how to do it. I'm Joe Ray. I'm an advisor with the Dutch government's Valuing Water Initiative, and I'll be your moderator today. So we have a fantastic panel with us this morning, but please don't forget this is an interactive session. So the chat box on the Pathable session page is already open. It'll stay open throughout the session. We encourage you to post your questions and your comments to our panelists as we go through. I'll be putting your comments to our panelists as soon as we reach the Q&A section about halfway through the session. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background as to why we in the Dutch government, through the Valuing Water Initiative, together with our co-conveners, whose logos you can see on the screen, why we were motivated to organise today's session in the first place. Now, all of us here today understand that water underpins all our social and economic activity. We rely on it for our food production, for sustaining our cities, and for supporting our ecosystems. But too often we still find that this resource is polluted or wasted or taken for granted. And as the government of the Netherlands and as the Valuing Water Initiative, we argue that it's time to start valuing water. Now that means embracing water's multiple values and finding inclusive ways to reconcile them. It means educating and empowering water stakeholders, protecting water sources, and investing for a water secure future. But it also means recognizing that for water to be truly valued, systemic transformation is needed, and that fiddling at the margins is no longer sustainable. Now, in pursuing that transformation, we can use water as an enabler of a more resilient future, which in turn can help us strengthen action on climate change. It can prepare us better for future pandemics, and it can help us to accelerate progress towards all of the SDGs, not only SDG 6. So where does youth engagement come in? Why do we find it so important? Now, the theme of World Water Week this year, as you all know, is building resilience faster. And our starting point for today is that one of the very best ways to build resilience is actually by empowering young people. Now, there are many different ways that this can be done. We'll be getting into some of those today. But in short, if you could summarize it in a sentence, we believe that empowering young people can help us to achieve more sustainable outcomes, both in the water sector and in society as a whole. Now, this is something that was recognized by the UN World Bank High-Level Panel on Water, which included Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, together with 10 other heads of state and government. And the High-Level Panel made the point in its report, Making Every Drop Count, that valuing water means recognizing and empowering underrepresented groups, particularly and explicitly women and youth. Now, this is actually enshrined in the first of the Valuing Water Principles, which is to recognize and embrace water's multiple values to different groups and interests, but also in the second principle, which is to reconcile those values in a way that's inclusive and that's equitable and that builds trust among different stakeholders. So in 2019, Prime Minister Mark Rutte launched the Valuing Water Initiative, or VWI, with the aim of operationalizing and putting into practice the Valuing Water Principles, and bringing systemic change in how water is valued in policy, practice, finance, and behavior. Now, at VWI, since our focus is on systems transformation, we think it's crucial that we don't unnecessarily duplicate or conflict with existing work that we know is happening in the youth engagement space. So with that in mind, before launching a new work stream focused on youth, we wanted to better understand what works, what doesn't work, what's needed when it comes to engaging with and empowering young people in the sector. So it's important to stress that our goal here isn't to launch something new for its own sake, but first to understand how our intervention could be most effective and to design a way forward accordingly. So we partnered with the Water Youth Network, which many of you I'm sure already are familiar with and who've been very active in co-convening this session with us, with the aim of carrying out a scoping study into the state of youth engagement in the sector today. Now, based on the findings of that study, we will be launching a youth engagement action plan for which we want your input. I'll get into the action plan launch a little later on, but at this point, I'm going to hand over to Lauren Ahrens, who is project co-lead at the Water Youth Network, and who's going to tell you more about the key findings from that scoping study. So Lauren, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Arnza and I'm representing the Water Youth Network. For those who don't know, it is a global connector and community of young professionals and students in the water sector, and our network enables connection between young people and organizations at various scales, local, regional and international, for achieving SDG 6. So as Joe mentioned, with my team, with the support of the Valuing Water Initiative, we undertook a scoping study to articulate the successes and failures of historical youth engagements. Our study drew from information of surveys, interviews, focus groups, and literature to learn from various young people and youth advocates, both within and outside of the water sector. Our study showed that young people are frequently underrepresented and disempowered in water governance and decision-making. And I'm going to discuss some of the main causes and what they mean. So hierarchical decision-making, which happens because youth are often seen to be underskilled or not having enough experience. Thus, more experienced persons usually only offer or provide opportunities where youth fulfill particular or predefined minor roles or limit their responsibilities. With regards to technocratic barriers, this usually occurs because youth engagement in the water sector is often focused on engineering solutions, which excludes youth and young professionals without that technical knowledge and background. As we know, there are many ways to engage with water challenges, and there's a need to include more approaches in tackling water issues. With regards to fragmentation across the youth engagement initiatives. So as you know, there are several, or I hope you know that there are several active youth groups, networks, advisory panels, and so forth. And many of us are undertaking good work in your particular sector or region, or some of us more globally. But we do find that many of these groups are attempting to solve similar problems, but unfortunately in silos. So there's definitely potential for more co-creation and co-action between these initiatives. Then there's tokenism and tick boxing, which we refer to as once-off activities where youth are engaged under the pretense of youth inclusion. This often leaves youth feeling used or disempowered, and there's little to no opportunity to really learn and develop any useful skills. Youth often feel undervalued in these roles, and this can cause fewer youth contributions as youth do not identify with the roles or the purpose, the goals or the purpose of these kinds of roles. Then there's lack of capacity development. So many youth and young professionals feel under-supported and often are not confident enough to share their knowledge or experience. There are many training opportunities to learn skills, but there's often a lack of opportunity to practice these skills. So there's a need for kind of exposure opportunities. We give youth and young people opportunities to build these capacities and practice these skills. And there's a need for more guided, mentored and supporting youth throughout these kind of learning processes. And the last kind of main cause here is the language barriers. Where this is kind of the elephant in the room in these kinds of conversations, where even though English is accepted as the global business language, large portions of the youth population do not speak English as their first language or at all. And many opportunities for youth engagement are primarily available in English and sometimes in French or Spanish, for example. But these opportunities do exclude many young voices from conversations and are not offering opportunities for non-English speaking people and young professionals and youth to benefit from capacity development opportunities. So in reflecting on some of these causes, we do believe that many of our solutions lie within all stakeholder groups having a role to play, and each of a stakeholder group being able to take specific actions to address these issues.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. A quick housekeeping comment here. I've received several questions. I see there are questions popping up in the chat. People can't currently see us as speakers. That's normal, and that apparently is a product of the platform that we're using. Just a quick note that once we get to the Q&A section in around 20 minutes or so, we will be closing the PowerPoint, and you will then be able to see all of our panelists, see their faces, see their expressions as they're answering your questions. And then at that point, we can have something of a dialogue. So just moving on, we've talked about why youth engagement is important. We've outlined some of the challenges facing young people in the water sector, and I want at this point to move on to the how to do it section of today's session. And Laura makes a very important point there that we believe all stakeholders have a role to play in driving transformation. This is really sort of in the core of the Value in Water Initiative, the systemic change framework that we use. There is a role for every type of actor, whether that's public sector, private sector, NGOs, civil society, research, academia. So each of our speakers today will be specifically addressing the role that different stakeholder groups can take. So I'd like to start introducing our panel now, and I'll start with Viviana Franco Hernandez. She is chair of the Outreach Committee at Youth for the Rhine, and Viviana will be talking about the role of civil society and NGOs when it comes to youth engagement. So Viviana, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Viviana, and today I'm representing Youth for the Rhine. Youth for the Rhine is a young initiative that aims to empower young generations living across the Rhine to be part of the solutions that we can have related to water, food security, and energy. So please, next slide. Yeah, so in the last decades, we have had multiple projects that have a different approach. So that sometimes is not working properly. So in a Youth for the Rhine, we think about the dynamic multinational and multi-party approach for co-creation. This is a bottom-up approach. So in challenges like water challenges, we cannot think just about water. We need to merge all different problems. And in this figure that you see today, we have the river basin challenges, which in our case is the Rhine, but also it has a potential replication for other river basins. But then you can see it here in the center, but then you see how everything merges. So we have the public awareness, ecosystem services, green funds, and all of this can be part of institutional, ecological, economic, and social level. So this is a new way to approach the challenges. So how we can think all over the picture and not just one challenge, and how we can actually address these kind of problems that we have nowadays, and also for younger generations. So in Youth for the Rhine, we are thinking how we can cover all of these. And the way that we started, it's with the problems. So which kind of problems we have? So social problems, economic, ecological, institutional. So please can we go to the next slide? So it's something that we call the ABCD co-creation model. And this has been a model that has been already applied in the Netherlands. And one successfully implemented project is called Room for the River. So first we start with D, which is the demos. And this is the nomination of problems, how we can address the problem. So we go and we start with the end users. And then we connect with the authorities. So we made this bridge between them so they don't feel that they are far away to be part of the solution. And then with all of them, we build these solutions with the identified problems. And we, as a civil service, we have an important role to connect these three letters, or these three parts of this model. And we strongly believe that this is a really successful way to empower young people and to make them actually part of the solutions. Because in some countries, like in Europe, France, for example, young people feel so far away from finding the solutions, be part of the giving ideas. Yes, so this is our main aim, to give them voice, to tell them you can be part of the solutions, you can influence the public policies. So this is the way that we do it in Youth for the Rhine, for the young generations, to empower them. And please, the last slide. So as a representative of an NGO in civil service, I have a few key recommendations. The first one is use a bottom-up approach as a mechanism to address water issues, but not just the water issues, just to see the whole picture, because we need to connect different challenges to be able to give more efficient solutions. The second is to establish this simplification of initiative connecting water, climate change issues, and at the end, to find new solutions, we cannot see it just in a technical way. We need to find a way to influence the policy making, so we will be able to make a change, right? And then work actively with NGOs focused in the water sector and another sector. So we need to all work together to be able to find solutions. So it's not a good way to address problems if we just focus on one problem. We need to all work together in different sectors to find good solutions. And as well, I think a good recommendation, and actually an example of it, it's commit to promoting internal youth candidates for external representation. So when we give voice to new people with new ideas, with a new mindset, we can find actually new kind of solutions. So, and in the public sector, so then we actually will be able to find perhaps new policymakers that can give another path to the challenge that we are facing nowadays. The two last ones is to connect the young end user, to empower them to take action in water challenges. So what I was telling before, it's just like give them the voice. You can be part of this. You can be part of the solution. You have the power. And I think this is something really important, even from kids, teenagers, and young professionals and students to start in a really young age to know, to have the knowledge and to be actively part of this. The end, engage multiple stakeholders and discuss the potential solutions. So those are my key recommendations for as a representative of Youth for the Rhine NGO.
Great, thank you so much, Viviana, and some really fantastic points there, some of which I think we'll also see again later on, just because they're common to so many of our different stakeholder groups. One more quick housekeeping comment from me here. So we are encouraging you to post questions, comments in the chat. Just to clarify, the chat within the Zoom window isn't enabled. So when we say the chat, we're talking about the session page on the World Water Week website. So do please share your questions, your comments as we go through. If you have specific questions for particular panelists, please highlight those and I'll come back to them then when we get to our Q&A section. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Neil Dott, who is Executive Director of Aquafed, the International Federation of Private Water Operators. Neil will be sharing lessons from the UN Water 2021 World Water Day campaign, and with a particular focus on policymakers. So Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone. Hope you're well. It's a big audience today, 100. That was quite big, much bigger than I expected. So welcome. So I'm going to tell you very quickly about what I heard during this exercise, the Water to Me listening exercise, which was, and I'm not talking my views at all. I'm here to represent what the young people and this network that I've kind of helped create around the world have told me. So I'm representing the views of others today. What I'm going to tell you is not rocket science, and it's not new, and it verifies very much what we heard just now in the scoping exercise. Just quickly on the listening exercise. So yes, it was part of the 2021 World Water Day campaign, which is about valuing water. Really brave decision, I think, by UN Water to kind of do this social media conversation as well, and even braver to let me kind of loose on it. We've had 6,000 social media conversations, 140 million impressions, 3,000 authors. So hopefully that gives some kind of statistical rigor and robustness in terms of what I'm about to say. It's not me making it up. It really is. There was, I have had hundreds and hundreds of conversations, either online or directly with people, particularly young people. And here's what they told me. Next slide, please. All right, so apologies for this disgusting slide, lots of words here. Let me bring it to life for you. The first one you can see, but it's action. So here's my first recommendation to policymakers. And by action, I mean that young people have said they want to touch, see and feel action. They don't want to just advocate. They don't want to just talk. They want to do things. A brilliant example I heard from a chap called Temple Areki, who I think is actually in the audience today. He told me about this Claim Your Water Rights campaign in Nigeria. And what happened was they started off as evidence gathering. This is sort of water, they being kind of young people in little networks, in little groups, kind of cooperating together, gathering evidence for the kind of the local state ministry or the state authority about where the problems were and the fact that some people were not getting their water and sanitation right fulfilled. They weren't getting access to the services. And it was a very progressive ministry, actually, because what they did was they said, okay, well, we'll hear your advice. And then they took the young group, the group of young people to the water treatment plant, and they explained to them what some of the problems were about how the pipes were being vandalized. And that was a real eye-opener. That's what Temple said. He said it was a real eye-opener. And then what happened was that the young people, they worked with the ministry to sort of raise awareness about trying to stop the vandalism of the pipes. So it was a really good partnership. And from there now what's happened is that the partnerships continued. The young people have raised another issue about the lack of water at an abattoir near a market. And again, the ministry is working with the young people on this project. So it's kind of snowballed into this kind of, this ongoing success and a real trusted partnership. And I think this started with about £2,000 worth of initial funding. So that £2,000 has gone a long, long way already. So I think that's a brilliant example. Temple, forgive me if I haven't explain that one properly. Next point that young people have said is they want more trust and independence. And this is something we've heard many times before and we seem to be reluctant to do. WASH change makers in Tanzania, and there's WASH change makers all over the world actually, but the Tanzanian one really resonated with me. It was about giving young men, really making them water ambassadors in their villages. And it's made a massive difference already. It's given them empowerment. It's made them feel, stronger and given them the will to really succeed. One of the very sad stories I heard during the listening exercise was Kerala schoolgirls who sent me a video of their rivers and lakes in Kerala. And we all know the rivers and lakes in Kerala are supposed to be one of the most beautiful places in the world, but they were full of plastic, full of rubbish. And they were saying that they want to help the authorities to monitor the situation, but they're just being totally ignored. So they want to take a stand on this and they want to help. The next point quickly is about peer-to-peer communication, and this will come out really strongly. I think the message I was hearing as kind of part of the international sector is basically back off, stop telling young people what to do and allow them to communicate with each other themselves and learn from each other. We have great examples, the Water Solutionaries Project, which is connecting young people near Lake Michigan in the States to Lake Victoria in Uganda, and they're talking because they have very similar issues, believe it or not, it spans continents, and they're learning from each other. A football tournament in the Tanzanian villages, another great small example of where you can use sport, which attracts loads of young people, not just young men, young women as well, and they use that as an opportunity to raise WASH issues. Very quickly, because I'm running out of time, formal platforms, things like the Kenya WASH Youth Parliament. So it's a kind of a national youth parliament, but also we've got Water Youth Network members here. Members of the Youth Parliament, I think, are in this audience. We need to do more of that. I've been a strong advocate all along for even giving up my role on UN Water and my seat there, or when I was on the Sanitation and Water for All Partnership steering committee, let a young person represent me instead. I can train them up, I can tell them what to help say and let them represent me. We need to really be much braver as an international sector. Let young people decide what success factors are. We as a sector seem to be really pleased with when we get a few likes on our tweet. It's just way outdated thinking. Let young people decide. And again, what I said earlier about youth representatives, there are so many gems and brilliant people all around the world that I've connected with. We have all the experience and knowledge we need. Talk to them on social media, actually talk to these people properly. Don't be frightened of them is the way that I would say to policymakers. And my final message is, don't tell young people what the problems are. They already know very well and they know what to do about it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Neil, for that. Great to have that perspective, and I'm sure many of our participants today will remember the Water to Me campaign, and indeed, as you see from some of the statistics there, the traction and the energy that campaign created with the Value Water campaign as well was really quite substantial. So great to be able to keep that momentum going through this session and into the future as well. So I'd like now to bring in Carla Muller-Zantop, who's Water Stewardship Engineer at Danone. And Carla will be sharing with us a perspective from the private sector, which we haven't spoken about so much yet, but which is absolutely crucial to this. So Carla, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. So as Joe has said, I work for Danone. I work for the water cycle team, so representing the private sector here today. And for me, I think there's two main points when we look at improved youth engagement in the private sector. I think the first side is what young people within the private sector should do. And we all know that we are more critical today than we were ever before. We want transparency and really concrete and measurable actions from companies. But I think that we should be much more demanding as young people, not just as consumers of products from private companies, but also really engaging as employees within these private companies to really challenge and criticize them from within. So I represent a huge food company here today, and I feel like I often have to defend this choice on why I chose to work for Danone. But I truly believe in being able to drive large-scale change from within these private sector companies that are contributing very, very broadly to this environmental degradation and resource extraction, as we all know. But I think that steering private companies that are destroying our environment currently with better motives and better business morals from within can really drive large-scale change, and it will allow us to collectively harness that power and the resources that these companies can have, because there are so many resources that need to be put to better use, and they have mass markets that they can reach. So the impacts of private companies we know are huge. So I think that we need more engaged and very critical young people within these companies to criticize and challenge them from within. So I think that's the first side. And then the second side on what the private sector managers can do is that I think, first of all, youth engagement has to become a much bigger topic. It's currently not really a huge and widely discussed within the private sector. It's rarely really mentioned in my work. We know that a good company culture is really essential for our generation, much more than it has been before. But I still feel like the management is very hierarchical. It's really top down. And the engagement and company culture initiatives that we have are really focused on youth only. So I don't know, onboarding new interns, for example, but we really lack this engagement of intergenerational experiences. And we really lack intergenerational exchange, as we've also heard from the speakers before. And I think that we need much more critical exchanges between these generations. So what really helped me was when I joined Danone, that we had a session with the then president for the nature team, where all the participants of the environmental sustainability teams could come together with him and ask really critical questions. That was really great to be able to be vocal on these points, and I felt like we could really, we could be very critical. And it helped us to kind of align on priorities and improve the cooperation that we have. So maybe you can go to the next slide, because these are, I'm just talking about the recommendations already now. So I think that really facilitating these very critical exchanges between the generations should not be a one-off thing, as it was for me just at the start of my career at Danone, but it should be more systematic through having intergenerational working groups to collectively build these strategic priorities within teams. So I think that's one big advice that I would love to see personally in companies, getting together with senior management and young new professionals, and have working groups where we're able to be vocal on the criticism and feel like we're being heard and that these criticisms are being implemented. So I think that generally this open feedback culture and encouraging young people to be more vocal is really crucial. And we've also heard that before, but I still feel like a lot of private sector managers have not really understood that yet. So in order to harness this entrepreneurial, creative, and critical energy that a lot of us young people have, what we had, which was a bit for a different purpose, but what I could imagine as being very successful for improved youth engagement in the private sector, is internal contests for ideas. So really encouraging not just local teams, but also young teams to develop ideas, for example, around water stewardship efforts. And then also not just internally, but also integrating much more within the water stewardship efforts that more and more companies are doing. These youth groups that Lauren has mentioned, for example, at the beginning, in the project design and implementation, that's something that I can say we do not focus on at all at the moment, and that's something that I would really love to encourage and do more in the future. And also just reiterating on the fact that we have to be trusted with autonomy and with increased responsibility. So I've been put in charge of some key topics at Danone, for example, a coalition that I lead on Danone's behalf on nature-based solutions. And I've been given this really great responsibility, but of course, I make a lot of mistakes because I'm not familiar with leading multi-stakeholder coalitions. So I do a lot of things wrong, but I'm allowed to make these mistakes, and I'm given the space and the freedom to learn from them. So that's something that I find very encouraging. And then the last part on engaging non-water experts. So like me, I'm not a water expert at all, but for all the different water topics where I lack the technical knowledge, I can work with the hydrogeologists, for example, that we have at Danone, work with them at eye level, and through that way complement our skills. So I think that all private sector companies looking to implement more projects and more commitments around water should not shy away from employing people that are not water experts, because I can see that we can still develop very positive and very successful initiatives together. And in general, one really important point that we've also just heard is that I think water is still too much a standalone topic. And we really need not just more intergenerational exchange, but also interdisciplinary exchange within companies. So for example, with the financing teams or the ingredient buyers, this is a crucial topic that I think when working in water, that it has to become a bit more broad and better integrated within companies in general. So just to sum that up, I think that for youth, we should not avoid the private sector. We should challenge it from within. And for private sector decision makers, I think you should allow this criticism, allow this open feedback, and listen to the critiques of young people, for example, within working groups, and then together collectively implement the change that we all know we so desperately need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla. That was fantastic. So important having a private sector perspective in these discussions. So thank you for being so candid and so insightful with your contribution. I'd like now to introduce our final panelist, Dr. Kees van Leeuwen is Principal Scientist at KWR Water Research Institute, and he's also a professor in water management and urban development at Utrecht University, amongst many other accolades from a long and very distinguished career. He'll be focusing on youth engagement in research and academia. So Kees, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Next slide, please. So youth engagement is our key is our key role. We do this by co-creation. It's our core business, so to say. And we started our research at KWR and Utrecht University about 10 years ago. We work with students and young professionals because that is a win-win. We educate students. They reach out to stakeholders to gather data to assess their cities. Together, we publish the results and they convey the results to their local authorities for follow-up actions. And last but not least, I learn a lot from students. It is so important as we are not meeting any of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in time. That is not my opinion, but it is a result of a publication by the United Nations Environment Programme just recently, but also based on our own research that I'm going to present in a minute. So this has motivated me a lot, not only as a scientist, but also as a grandfather. I became a grandfather 10 years ago. And so when my granddaughter will be a grandmother, there will be 11 billion people on this planet. And the conclusion from that is that sustainability will not be an option. So the work that we are doing is basically a diagnosis, a broad diagnosis of cities. And then, well, I'm going to present you a little bit that first part. Next slide, please. So what we do, we have developed a set of indicators, actually 24, and we ask students to gather that information in order to provide a city blueprint. And we also calculate a blue city index, which is the geometric mean of the 24 indicators. And they also go from 0 to 10, where 0 is a concern and 10 is no concern. And we do that with the stakeholders. So the first thing they do is to look for stakeholders they need in order to gather the data they need to do this city blueprint. Next slide, please. And this is work that was finished recently by another master student, Chloe Crison. And this is a summary of the work that we did over the last 10 years. And you see dots and you see triangles, and there are different colors. And the blue colors are cities that perform very well. And currently there are only 2 cities that perform very well, and that is Amsterdam and that is Singapore. And all other cities are still in a process to become water wise. Then you see the triangles, and these are estimates that we did on the basis of an estimation model that we applied for 75 cities. So you actually see 125 cities of which we have done an assessment in detail, and the triangles represent 75 cities for which we have done an estimate of the blue city index. And so there is a lot to do, and that is what I said when we are not going to meet any of the SDGs in time. And this shows really what is happening in our city. And most of the cities are in a process of, I would say, developing a sewer, developing a sewage treatment plant, and connecting wastewater to that sewage treatment plant. The average blue city index on the globe is about 4. So it means that many cities are still in a very, I would say, early phase of development of a water-wise infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this is work we did together with UNESCO. We have assessed a couple of cities in Africa. The students have assessed the cities, collected the data, and this is where they discussed the results with us last year in Africa, just before the Corona crisis hit us. Next slide, please. And what is important is that once we have reviewed the data, that they go out and discuss the results of their assessments with the local authorities in order to create follow-up actions to make their cities water-wise again. Next slide, please. So the key recommendations, I've already, I think, summarized them. Capacity building via research is very important to influence policymaking and to transition to a water-wise future. The problem-solving capacity of young people should not be underestimated. It can be catalyzed through capacity building, and that is why we have done this work, mentorship programs, and connect seniors with juniors. Next slide, please. I have not had a lot of time to discuss the methodology. I fully understand that. That is not the subject of today. What is important is that we teach students and that they help us to assess it. And this is a couple of links that you can look for if you want more information. And that is it. Joe, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kees, and thank you for keeping your remarks so concise as well. I know there's a lot more information here, but these slides are available, so if people take a photo of the slide, they'll be able to pursue this information afterwards. Next slide then, please, Philip. So just very briefly from my side here on behalf of the Valley Water Initiative, before we get into the Q&A, at VWI, we believe quite strongly that in order to drive systems transformation, you need to take a systemic approach to problem definition before embarking on funding new projects. And for us as donors, that also means identifying whether supporting existing work is more impactful than starting new projects or new work streams. And that's exactly what we're trying to achieve by having carried out this scoping study that Lauren talked about a little earlier on. Final quick point here is that we think donors, particularly governments, have really substantial convening power that could often be used maybe a bit more strategically to incentivize collaboration and as a way to combat some of the fragmentation that we often see in the water sector. Lauren referred to the fragmentation among different youth engagement initiatives. And while there's a lot of fantastic work that's happening, a lot of it is quite disconnected, sometimes disjointed. And so we're very keen that our intervention as government, as Valley Water Initiative, is sort of as targeted and as strategic as it can be without necessarily reinventing the wheel each time we want to support a new project. Okay, so we're going to close the slideshow here. Philip, I think if you can just stop viewing. And now, hopefully, all of you can now see our speakers. I can certainly see our speakers for the first time. I see that the chat has been really active all through the session, which is wonderful. And I see also that many of our speakers have been answering questions in the chat as they pop up, which is fantastic. So here we've got around about 10 minutes or so, 12 minutes perhaps, to go through your questions. I've noted down a couple of them, but please keep them coming as we go through. One of the questions that stood out to me, maybe it's a big one. It really gets to the core of what we're trying to discuss here today. How can youth move from participation to influence? So maybe just a very quick fire round on this one, starting perhaps with Carla, if you have any thoughts on this. How do we move from participation to influence?
So these are 2 points that I've already mentioned that I think are really critical. On the one hand, working within the private sector, as I've said before, and the second part on engaging more with water youth networks within water stewardship projects. I think that's really where we implement concrete action as private companies. And I think within these efforts, we have to engage much more youth, and that will enable them to have influence as well on these projects.
Great, thank you, Carla. And then a question maybe for Kees here is what can be done, what more can be done, building on the excellent presentation you already shared, to blend the talent of young people that, as we all know, is out there with the experience of more senior professionals? Yeah,
well, I would like to go back to the question that you asked, Carla. I want to add to that in many fast-growing countries, the average age is about 18 or 20 years. That means that young people have a lot of voting power, political voting power, because they represent the largest part of the population. They also have a lot of power as consumers because they are the largest share of the population. So that is I would like to add to what has Carla said. And I am really overwhelmed about with the capacity of young people as master students, but also the work we do with UNESCO, with young professionals. So when you really guide them, help them to go in that steep learning curve, they end up with fantastic reports. We try to publish it, and we have published about 40 papers in the last 10 years with always students. But then the last part is also very important. First, for instance, the example of cities in Africa. When the students in Africa have done an assessment of their own city, they are going to convey the outcome of that assessment, that diagnosis, to their politicians, the local politicians and directors of water utilities or wastewater utilities. And in this way, they hear from the young people what needs in order to be done for their, I would say, sustainable future. And that is, I would say, a very, very strong way of communicating, rather than that retired old people like me are conveying the message. It is fantastic if young people do it. And politicians also understand that because of this last voting share they have. So also for the future, and many politicians only think short term, also for the future of the politicians, it is very relevant that they take the advice of young people very seriously. Thank you.
Thanks, Kees. And I think just on that question of incentives and the incentives that exist for more senior professionals to empower and engage with younger people, maybe I can bring in Neil here. There's a question in the chat as to what more can be done to sort of teach or incentivize senior professionals to listen to their younger colleagues in particular. So when it comes to things like mentorship and sort of empowering young people, how can we incentivize more senior generations to do that in a more effective way?
There's a very practical way of doing it in reality, which is put it into their annual appraisal and their performance. You know, we all have these, right? I mean, we all, but I've throughout my career, I've had these cases. Nodding, he knows what it's like. Philip, Viviana, you know, we all know we have these kind of annual appraisals, and you're judged on your performance. And a progressive organization will put an objective in for a senior manager to say, well, how many, you know, what have you done for this? And it can be articulated in many ways. I can't probably give a specific example now, it'll depend on the context, but in principle, I think the channel is that senior manager's annual appraisal. I think it's a very boring answer, but I think that's the kind of thing that exercises senior managers, because that's how they're judged every year. Some of them will be on bonuses, you know, in some organizations, and if they are, even better, you know, tie some of their bonus to this issue.
Yeah, great, thank you, Neil. It's a very concrete and specific question. Maybe I can bring in Viviana here. So there was a question earlier on in the chat concerning how NGOs can get young experts involved in their projects. And Viviana, there was also a question from Kirsten de Vet, former colleague, in fact, from IWA, around how Youth for the Rhine have experienced the reception from that program amongst policymakers and other sort of stakeholder groups. So first of all, how have Youth for the Rhine been sort of perceived and accepted, and what kind of connections do you have? And then how can NGOs get young experts involved in their projects?
Yeah, well, I think in the way that we have been addressing the problems, and you know, like the projects are born from different problems that we have. So as a Youth for the Rhine, I think network has been the most important part of it. So we have been trying to reach different parts of the society. So like we are aware that the young experts sometimes are not known in the sector. So we are bringing this network to make them be known by like the big projects. So, or for example, for as well for the government. So then when we have, for example, the Ministry of Water and Infrastructure, so then when you have a direct connection with them, you can show them the capacities that you have as a young expert, because we have all the knowledge and everything is fresh for us. So I think the network, it's the key for being part of the projects, and to be able to show your skills and your capacity to develop solutions. And then the part for the policy makers, right? So this is something that it's a key as well to solve the problems, to be heard. So I think we are at the moment in Youth for the Right in the first stage of the project. So basically we have been focused on identifying all the problems, but as well we have been contacting members of the European Parliament to make them a bridge to this change in the policy making, because at the moment there are institutions and also like members of the European Parliament that have a huge interest in these kind of projects, and they are actually open to listen to different organizations, like as we are the youth initiative. So I think Youth for the Rhine, a project like this, it's an amazing opportunity for young professionals, for young generation, for young farmers, and to be able to be listened. So I think that's the way that I will answer it.
Great, thank you, Viviana. Maybe I can bring in Lauren here. So Lauren, there's a question in the chat from the Valley Water Initiative team lead, in fact, that there are already so many platforms out there, as you've alluded to already in the presentation of the scoping study results. How can we sort of reduce the noise a little bit? So it's not that these platforms are necessarily in conflict with one another, but how can we be more strategic in connecting them and collaborating between different platforms and initiatives which may be working on similar issues, but which are still quite disconnected sometimes?
Thanks, Joe. So I don't really have the answer to this question, because I think there's a larger, a big task at hand here. But I do think there is a need to kind of just advocate, like make these youth organizations more present. So I think a lot of people know about one or two of them, and then are slowly starting to find out about more of them. So if there's a way to bring these together, or like get them to start to talk to each other, because I don't think that we should stop, or like I don't think we should create one big youth organization, because I think there's a need for them in their either region or sector, because they're reaching a specific target group already, and that's another group of youth that or young professionals that are being engaged. So there's a need for those individual groups, but there is much more of a need for, this is what we're doing, are you doing something similar, or how can we learn from each other? So almost like a learning process that can be shared between these groups. So understanding who are the actors in this space, and supporting them together in some sort of way.
Great, thank you, Lauren. And just briefly for Case, what do you feel would have happened if young people in the examples that you gave had not been given the mentoring and the support to develop the solutions that they've been developing in that example? So can we sort of hypothesize about what might have been missed had that support not been available?
Yeah, I think that what we currently see, and that has also been said by Neil, it is a snowballing effect. So we train young people, and then they go out, get jobs, become NGOs, work for the government or for water utilities, and they bring on that experience. And what I see, and that is what I also hope for, is that they attract new young staff, they train them, they educate them. And so I have seen students that worked in Asia, and they are participating in workshops like this, and they convey the messages to next generations, if so to speak. And what we do with UNESCO in Africa is that we involve the young professionals who had done their assessment of cities in the next phase of the project. So they become a kind of coaches for new young professionals. So I think because we are really far behind, we are really off track with SDG 6. We really need young people, and we need to accelerate that process of teaching, to educate them, to improve the methodologies, and to create follow-up actions to make their cities waterwise. So I would approach it for a more positive side. We really need them, and I don't want to think what has happened if you would not have educated them, Joe. I really think we need a lot of hands and a lot of brains and a lot of, I would say, energy to keep up with the SDGs in the next decades to come, because it will take decades, certainly in cities.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of 8 years to reach the goals of 2030. For cities, we will need another 20 years at least to get it better.
All right, thank you, Kees. No, it's a very important point, and I see that's also coming back in the chat as well. Vincent makes the point that investments in young people are the most sustainable investments you can make, because you can sort of harvest that investment.
Absolutely. I mean, this is also what has been said by our African students. Yeah. They said, "Don't send us money, but please train us."
Yeah.
And I fully support that view.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Kees. So we've got a couple of minutes left, and there's a very important slide that I think Philip is going to pop up for us now, if that's possible. So this is on the Youth Engagement Action Plan, which we told you about at the beginning of the session. VWI and the Water Youth Network are looking for partners to help us to develop and implement a new multi-stakeholder work package for empowering more young people in the water sector. So this will build on the findings of the scoping study. It will seek to address some of the challenges that were outlined by Lauren earlier and that have been talked about by our speakers. There will be a core group to be financed and to take ownership of specific work streams, but we also want to create a sort of looser community of interested parties who are committed to learning from the action plan and strengthening their own youth engagement activities. So here we'd like to invite you to join us. The QR code that's on the screen will take you to a Google form. You can register your interest, and we will then follow up with you after the session in the coming weeks to provide more information. I see that the link has already just been put in the chat, so you can access it that way. If you're watching this session back on record, you'll find the link to the Google form at the bottom left of the session program in Pathable. So you can express your interest via the Google form in becoming one of the core parties in the action plan, or you can express interest simply in receiving further information about the action plan when it launches. In both cases, simply enter your details. We will follow up with you directly. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the conclusion of today's session. So just briefly before we close, QR code is still on screen for those who haven't clicked through yet. You will probably have seen, or you may not yet have seen, that this isn't the only youth event that's happening at Stockholm today. We've talked all day about collaboration, which is really crucial to us. So I encourage everybody to sign up for the session at 5 o'clock Central European time on the multi-dimensional role of youth in building resilience. We've talked about young people being part of a more resilient future, and the session later this afternoon will be getting stuck into the details of exactly how that can be done. So that's it from us. Thank you. Special thanks, in fact, to all of our co-conveners. We haven't had space for everybody to speak, but this is a group of organisations that's really committed to making a difference for young people in the water space. I'd like to thank all of them for their contributions to preparing the session. Above all, thanks to you, our participants, for joining us today, and we wish you an enjoyable World Water Week. Thank you very much.
Thanks.